Okay, I think we'll get started as this is only a 45-minute session. So thank you for everyone joining. This is the third part in our Advanced Talk webinar series. My name is Leonie Loftus. I'm the Senior Comms and Policy Officer at Advance. And today's session is called From Victim to Defendant, the Impact of Trauma on Women's Pathways to Offending. Too often women are victims of serious crime who are also then criminalized. Rather than being supported, their lives are uprooted and the lives of them and their loved ones. So this session aims to look at those particular needs and vulnerabilities of women, particularly their experience of abuse and trauma, and how they can intersect with their offending. I do want to note that this webinar will cover a range of potentially triggering topics, such as domestic abuse and mental health and suicidal ideation. So please do just prioritize your mental health and well-being and take some time out if you need to. And we also have the chat function. So any questions you can kind of ask them directly to myself or one of the panelists. And we have the Q&A function. So when we get down to questions, you're more than welcome to kind of put questions to myself and the panelists. So I'll get on and get onto the questions, but first I'll introduce our panelists. So first we have Summer Alston-Smith. Summer is the Director of Development and Insights and has over a decade's experience in the charity sector, focused on criminal justice work, and she was previously Director of Criminal Justice Services at Advance. Following on her PhD research in collaboration with a serious organised crime agency, the National Offender Management Service and the Metropolitan Police, Summer has led on multiple research and evaluation projects, including co-produced research with the University of Cambridge and University of Sheffield. Summer is experienced in creating innovative bids rooted in the needs of service users for statutory and grant funding. We have Caroline Phillips. Caroline Phillips is the Senior Service Manager for Advance's Criminal Justice Services. She oversees operations across South Central and Bedfordshire and manages the regional partnerships. South Central, East of England and Kent, and has worked for Advance for the last 2.5 years. More widely, she has an extensive career within the criminal justice system for 22 years. Caroline has also worked as a senior manager for both a homelessness charity and in supported accommodation for care leavers and unaccompanied asylum-seeking young people. We also have Elisa Johnston. Elisa is the Senior Service Manager at Advance's Criminal Justice Services, overseeing operations across South Central and Bedfordshire and manages regional partnerships. She joined Advance 18 months ago, and previously she was a service manager for a care quality commission service. Her career expands across mental health, offender management, homelessness, and working with behaviours that challenge. And Ramisha Patel. Ramisha is the Senior Service Manager for Domestic Abuse Projects, co-located within health and children's social care settings, covering North and West London. With over 12 years experience in the VOG sector, she has held roles spanning frontline service, delivery, training, operational leadership, and strategic management of services. So as you can tell, a very experienced panel. So I will go straight into the questions. So I will ask each panelist one question, and then we'll kind of enter into a more wider discussion. So to start, I'll start with Lisa. Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about your understanding of how women's experience of trauma impacts on women's offending?
Yes, so we did some more in-depth research into this recently for our Lunch and Learn events, and I was actually quite surprised to see the actual number of women coming through on our referrals that were happy to share with us whether they'd had a history of domestic violence, and it was near on 70% at that point. Now, that broken down, we looked at some sort of case studies of how that looked, and essentially it showed that a lot of the offending that women were coming through was directly linked to the trauma that they'd experienced and the situation that had put them into in real life and how that looked. And that can be really eye-opening to see the amount of situations that they're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And from that, Caroline, could you kind of broaden that out and just talk about what community support means and explain to us the kind of Minerva model that Advance runs?
Okay. So Minerva is the overarching title of our criminal justice services that we have here in Advance, and they're right across the southeast regions, right into London. Generally, this is a commissioned service that's commissioned by the Ministry of Justice, and we work very closely with probation, who we accept all our referrals from. So they come through a system called Refer and Monitor, and they will go to like the service manager, who will have a look at the referral and then allocate it out. So what generally happens is it will go out to a triage key worker, and they will do the initial assessment with the women. So they're very mindful about not re-traumatizing women. So within the referral, it's trying not to ask maybe the same questions that have been asked numerous times. It's trying to be led by women. So they have a look at the referral, and the referral is generally highlighted by a number of support needs. And these are of 8 categories that will come through to us. Now, a woman may be referred to us with one support need, or they might be referred to us for a number of support needs. So the areas that we're working on are accommodation, education, training and employment, finance, benefits and debt, dependency recovery, their emotional well-being, family and significant others, lifestyle and associates. And for those women that are in custody, there's also social inclusion that is added to that. That is then by the probation practitioner. They make an assessment of the complexity of that need. So it could be between low, it could be medium, or it could be high. And that then would often determine the support then and the number of sessions that we feel the woman would benefit from. So once we've made that decision, we basically create a support plan with the woman to look at those needs. So we will be asking her, this has been identified by your probation practitioner, but what do you think about this particular need? What support can we offer you in terms of accommodation or in terms of emotional well-being? And we're guided by the woman. So we're looking at really very specialist and individualized support. So if a woman is struggling, particularly with accommodation, which I'm sure all of you know is very difficult to obtain no matter where you live really in the UK. So we are seeing, you know, numbers of women that are finding themselves homeless. So we will look to work with local councils. Once a duty of refer form has been put in, we would look to support them in terms of how can they access accommodation? Is the accommodation they've got at the moment safe, secure? Because often our women are reporting to us that they don't feel safe. It may be mixed accommodation. So we will try and work and we will bring in other specialist partners as well. So we may be going to shelter because somebody has been denied accommodation based on that they don't have a local connection to that particular area. So we will potentially petition the council. We may try and get in contact with housing departments themselves. We will go with women if needs be, if they are going for an interview, to support them. So generally, we are looking at very bespoke and tailored approach. I would say that probably 97% of our referrals that come through to us will always have an emotional well-being need. And that can range from previous traumas, as was touched on by Lisa. You know, we're working with women that are encountering significant abuse and can, you know, be recovering from traumas, can be recovering from past relationship issues, and, you know, suffer from a lack of resources themselves, whether it's, you know, socioeconomic. They could be coming out of prison, and, you know, particularly we see a high number of women that potentially don't have accommodation on coming out of prison. So we're really looking at what does that woman need? How can we work with them? And we will work in a way that we will basically, sorry about that, it's typical, isn't it? Your phone goes off. But we will look at working with women, whether that's in the community. They will come into our women's only spaces. So we have women's centres across the regions, Or for some women, we may go to co-located hubs. So we'll work hand in hand with probation, which is a great way of sharing information and supporting women. Or we might, to try and build up that rapport and that support, that we will maybe work with a woman over the phone. Some women are, significantly suffer from mental ill health, and we may build up that rapport by meeting them, talking to them on the phone, and then work up to meeting them in person. So we're really trying to work in a way that works for women. We're not trying to impose our model of operation. We're trying to work in a way that suits them and helps them to engage in our service.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I mean, you spoke a lot there about kind of women's experiences of abuse and kind of violence against women and girls. Ramisha, could you kind of speak a bit about what impact you see that domestic abuse and other forms of gender-based violence can have on the lives of women and their children, if that's the case?
Yeah, domestic abuse has a massive impact on the lives of like women and children. It's a global matter, and that just says it all. And when you think about it, that link with the different various types of impact that they can experience, some that Caroline already mentioned, things like mental health, impact with social care, children's social care or adult social care involvement, and that impact on children directly, housing being issues, financial concerns for those women and those families, family dynamics being disrupted as a result of the abuse that's been experienced, and what we're here to speak about as well, women then being involved in sort of like criminal behaviors. It goes further than that, because there are complexes as a result of why women may be impacted by crime, not just experiencing it themselves, but also may participate in some of those criminal behaviors, not of their own accord, but as a result of other complexes that might be going on. And we know that domestic abuse is, holding that sort of power and control over that victim survivor. So there are many sort of scenarios where women have built coping mechanisms as a result of the abuse with substances. They may be coerced into managing or dealing drugs, such as like county lines concerns as well. They may have built up trauma that they haven't yet been able to like unpack. And unless you're really able to see the root cause of the impact that they're experiencing, and where their trauma comes from and where their experiences come from, unless you're able to unpack that, you're not able to then provide that level of support and some of the support that Caroline kind of mentioned as well. Children are impacted as a result. They're indirectly and directly impacted. And now with the Domestic Abuse Act, we know that children in their own rights are also victim survivors of domestic abuse, and it gives that recognition, which then provides more attention and identification of the various types of behaviours that they might experience, or what we might want to identify as a result of that family's experience around domestic abuse as well. Women are often caught up with having to manage children being in care, or having children's services involvement as a result of their experiences. There's stigmas around women having criminal behaviours, or having been in prison, which then also means that they're subjected to professional stigmas, where potentially you're unable to kind of really differentiate in being able to have that confidence in a woman taking those steps to change behaviour. But often there's a lot more complexes there, and it means that women have to go through so many different hurdles to really be believed and evidence that they're able to care for their children, they're able to parent their children as well. And then there are many other sort of physical, practical factors such as housing, not having that sort of having an unstable home, or having been part of behaviors such as like cuckooing, or having your home controlled by, let's say, gangs, or the abuser who may exploit that home. It may mean that you might be at risk of losing your tenancy, which then makes it harder for departments and external services to kind of see how you might maintain those services if they can see that pattern of offending and behavior as well. So there are many different types of impact. It's not an exhaustive list in terms of what I'm sharing today, but there are so many different forms of effects. And when you look at the underlying cause of concerns, you're talking about women here who are essentially being harmed on a regular basis, and as a result of fear. And that's what leads to some of these complexes, and the reason why they may not be able to kind of leave these circumstances and are stuck in these situations, and that lead to some of this offending as well. And it's a difficult position to be in. So it doesn't seem quite uncommon that one of the complexes might be that they are also stuck in a system where they are affected by crimes, and that also leads into finances as well, because financial abuse and economic abuse is a very important factor, and a lot of women don't have control over their money. They don't have access to money. They may be working for the perpetrators, kind of like managing like drugs and substances, but not actually having any access or resources, which can lead to sort of petty crimes like theft, for example, as well. So there are many sort of impacts on the lives of women experiencing domestic abuse, and the trauma that they may not even get a chance to manage as a result of all the practical factors that are ongoing in their lives.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'm sure we'll kind of expand on those further, but that was so comprehensive. And also, I just want to apologize. My computer is being a bit glitchy, so I've had a bit of a delay, so I apologize if I cut you off, Caroline. I think I did. I apologize. And then Summer, can you, I'm kind of expanding on everyone's kind of points. Can you just explain a little bit about Advance and how we came to deliver services kind of across criminal justice and domestic abuse, kind of throughout our 25 years?
Thanks, Leonie. Yeah, I mean, summarizing a lot and weaving a lot of what's been already said together, I think this is certainly a unique part of Advance's history and sort of how we find ourselves where we are 25 years after being formed. And we were, Advance is the brainchild of Bear Monteith and Beryl Foster, who've both subsequently been awarded OBEs for their contribution to the women's movement. And it was very much founded as a domestic abuse charity. And the sort of concept and sort of driving force behind the organization was looking at how the domestic abuse response at the time was very much centered on refuges for women, which absolutely have a valuable place and a role to play. But for our founders, they didn't understand why that was the only option for women, that women had to leave their homes and be relocated somewhere else, removed from their local communities, their familiar settings, children that would need to be moving schools, away from their friends and family, when they were the victims and not the perpetrators. So the perpetrators weren't having to uproot their lives, but actually victims were. And so there was very much a drive to think about how women could be supported in the community and for the support to meet them where they were. And alongside that, our founders thought, how do we do that? And actually key to that is working in partnership with agencies around in the local area and around the woman, whether that is health, social care, the police, etc. So very much the DNA of how Advance works is by having a coordinated response that links in with statutory services, thinking about how women can have a sort of a holistic wraparound form of support, whereby they have a sort of a named advocate that's working alongside them. And for our domestic abuse services, that's in the shape of the IDVA model, the Independent Domestic Violence Advisors, but certainly in terms of then working within the statutory services, so that we were co-located with police and health services to invoke change from within those organizations, for them to see the impact that our advocates could have on women's lives, They could see how their practice could be more trauma informed and more rooted in the woman's experience, and sort of looking at how she would like to be supported, very much in line with what Caroline said. And so we took a lot of that learning into our criminal justice services. And the reason why we sort of moved into criminal justice work with the inception of Minerva in 2011 was because we saw so often that women who we were working with as domestic abuse survivors and victims were going to the police and were being let down by the police response in various ways, many of which are still true today, whether they weren't being believed or the onus on evidence was on them, or just simply not getting a quick response, not having a sort of a trauma-informed approach to how those women were being interacted with, and that sort of reluctance to see a case through the prosecution because of the barriers that women experience as victim survivors, and the reluctance to report and the reluctance to go back to the police and so on. But what we then found really interesting was that the same woman who then had sort of suffered the effects of the trauma and abuse and had led to them coming to the attention of the police, but now as offenders on the other side of the victim offender kind of coin, that actually they faced new but different forms of barriers in interacting with the police, whether that is the fundamental gender-based discrimination that we see with women in criminal justice system, where they are given they are arrested for offences, low-level offences, things that men would not be arrested for, or certainly finding themselves in prison for low-level offences, whether that's not paying TV licenses and fines, truancy, and so on. So, sort of petty crimes, shoplifting, etc., very much non-violent, low-level offending. So we saw an interesting conundrum that actually the women were getting different responses from the police depending on how they presented, but ultimately it was the same woman and being let down in some systematic ways by the same agencies that she was working with. And, Ramisha mentioned social services as another example where there can be, not always, but there can be various levels of stigma that women face, whether they are in a domestic abuse situation with a perpetrator. One stigma is, why don't you just leave? And likewise, as an offender, if you went to prison, you're a bad mother, therefore you don't deserve to keep your children, and so on. So again, sort of really thinking about how can we work within systems to evoke systemic change by working alongside, side by side with our statutory partners on a journey to see how can we improve the response to women, both as victim survivors and offenders, and really highlight, and we had a unique vantage point because we were working with women who were presenting as both sides, as victims and offenders. And so really kind of had that visibility of this is an untapped sort of phenomenon that not a lot of organizations are chimed into, that actually they're the same women, and sometimes their offending behavior is very much driven by domestic abuse that they're experiencing. And Ramisha gave many poignant examples of not only indirect influences of why women's offending behavior might stem from their domestic abuse experiences and previous trauma, but also direct links. And, adding to what Ramisha said, we know of women who have been convicted of fraud where they have been asked without really their knowledge or understanding to be part of companies and businesses, and they've just been asked to sign things without understanding what they're signing, and then find themselves imprisoned as a result. And so that sort of unique vantage point has very much led to how we work in the Minerva service. And, as Caroline helpfully outlined, and likewise, as Lisa pointed out, that trying to make a sort of trauma-informed, a sort of domestic abuse approach very much is sort of instilled and embedded in our Minerva response. And a lot of the work that we do around that is around our policy and influencing work, whether that's through, for example, the London Blueprint, or working in partnership with collaborative organizations like the National Women's Justice Coalition. It's driving that message for policymakers to really understand and see that the two they're not two separate categorizations. Actually, they are very much interwoven. And as an example, we did some work back in sort of 2017 with Prison Reform Trust to drive research on this, looking at the research. There's a Reason Why We're in Trouble that Prison Reform Trust published now, coming up to almost a decade ago, shockingly. but that's some of the work that we've been doing throughout our time to highlight the fact that the response that women need is one that sees through a lens where both criminal justice and domestic abuse actually interwoven and come together, and understanding how the two link. We also kind of really try to champion that the services around women in the criminal justice service, whether that's prison workers or probation staff, really see that link. And as Caroline explained, domestic abuse isn't on its own a key highlighted as a rehabilitative need of women. It's sort of encompassed within sort of family and significant others, but we really would like to advocate that it's seen in and of its own, on its own merit, and assessed in its own right. We look at sort of how some of the learnings that we have from other projects. For example, we have a pan-London accommodation scheme for women who are domestic abuse survivors, and that includes a sanctuary scheme where we work with women to support them in keeping their houses safe. We have a bespoke pot of funding for pragmatic solutions like locks and alarms. So again, as Caroline says, sort of taking our learning from the domestic abuse work that we're doing and seeing how we can then translate that to support our criminal justice women in remaining safe in their homes, and thinking about how we can make them safer. And so again, we, as we talked about earlier, Advance are working nationally across the southeast, sort of Hampshire, Thames Valley, Essex, Hertfordshire, Kent, and with partners in Bedfordshire as well as London. And we're trying to look at how we can use our national profile to examine trends, see how if there are any differences. And so far, I think, as we said earlier, it's safe to say that domestic abuse up and down the country is pretty much endemic as a driving factor and force behind women's offending. And certainly where we know that power and control is very much at the origin of domestic abuse, we also reflect how there are elements and dynamics of power and control in the way the criminal justice system is set up, and how it's designed for men, by men. It doesn't work for women, and trying to sort of break some of those barriers to supporting women effectively within that system.
There was a lot of points there that I think we will pick up, but and actually, so firstly, we will kind of open up to a kind of broader conversation discussion where we'll kind of talk about a lot of the points, some that you've just brought up, and a lot of the points that have been brought up already. And please do jump in. I'll ask a question and jump in, and obviously I will kind of point to you if needed. So just kind of on what you were speaking about there, and I'm sure you covered some of it already, Summer, what and where are some of those gaps that fail to recognize that link between women's trauma and their offending behavior?
There are many gaps, and I won't labor too much, but I do think a huge element is the systemic approach by which our response to women is compartmentalized, whereas actually encouraging sort of co-commissioning models and collaborative working across government departments is key in breaking some of that siloed working. So getting, health, justice, education departments together to think about how they can approach women's issues in a holistic way. And it stops us sort of categorizing women as either criminal justice women or domestic abuse survivors, and actually seeing them as a whole person and having a person-centered, women-led approach is key. I think in sort of hearing from the voices of women and amplifying their voices will drive some of that change, and they are best placed to tell us what those gaps look like for them, recognizing very much the intersectionality of the women that we represent across a range of protective characteristics and demographics. And so I think having women's voices amplified so that they can speak directly and speak their truth to power, I think is extremely important, so that policymakers really understand beyond the layers of evaluations and research and data, actually the human beings that who are at the core of all of the work that we do. I think sometimes that stops us from conceptualizing issues as in boxes, and actually having a holistic approach that will then drive a difference to the way that solutions are formed, because they then are sort of circular rather than being sort of siloed, which then leads to those gaps forming in between the boxes that tend to be ticked. Of course, funding is always a gap. Funding is always something that drives that siloed working. And again, I think co-commissioned funding projects and beyond sort of collaborative policy building, again, will address some of those gaps that exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And Caroline or Lisa, just on that kind of operational, you oversee the kind of criminal justice services for Advance. I mean, do you have anything to add within that area around kind of what gaps you see there? I'll let either one of you jump in.
I think, interestingly enough, the courts, I think there's a lot of gaps in the courts and a lot of misunderstanding about women's offending. So I think particularly more maybe in magistrates, which is primarily where a lot of women end up getting sentenced. I don't think all the dots are connected. There's a disconnect in understanding. For men, protective factors are often having stable relationships, connections with family, but for women, that's not a protective factor. They're often dysfunctional and they're abusive. And I think in trying to understand a good degree of women's offending is actually driven by these dysfunctional relationships, whether it's, oh, well, if you hold on to these drugs for me, this is your first offence, or you haven't been convicted of this type of offence before, therefore you'll get a caution, where actually, women sometimes don't have the knowledge, and that's never going to happen for them. They could end up being sentenced, or strangely enough, I've seen it numerous times where women have taken the blame for drink driving when it wasn't them that was driving at the time. And it's just surprising. I think the more you work with women, that you see there's gaps in understanding those drivers for offending. And I would love to see, the courts being better informed about that and understanding those difficult relationships that women have, which is often potentially leading to reoffending because they can't break free of these dysfunctional relationships that are really toxic towards them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure, Lisa, you'll probably kind of echo that. Do you have anything to kind of add?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think I see a lot of the gaps actually in the amount of women that are in custody that are actually unsentenced. Majority of the women that are in custody are unsentenced, and there needs to be more options around incarcerating them, removing them from families and children. The consequences of holding them in custody is huge for a woman, and then can often lead to intergenerational trauma as well, because it's then impacting the children and then wider family, the caring responsibilities and everything that goes alongside with that. And actually, when their case gets to court, it may be that they don't need a custodial sentence, but they've then got to deal with the impact of being held on remand. And there are a large number of women that are held in custody in that way, rather than looking at the alternatives, like support this in the community to help them address those criminogenic needs, which we know is more successful from research. So for me, that's a huge gap that can be addressed and have quite a significant impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to kind of expand on that and just find out what kind of, can you discuss a little bit about the kind of intersections that you see between kind of whether it's race or obviously we're talking about gender and kind of socioeconomic factors that kind of play into this understanding or lack of understanding of women's particular needs and vulnerabilities. And this might be from the point of view, Ramisha, when you're dealing with women who are affected by domestic abuse who haven't been criminalised, but also on that kind of for women who have offended. Again, I'll let anyone jump in, but I'm also happy to pick on you. Okay, let's start with Ramisha, just so that we can get a domestic abuse lens there.
I think when we're speaking about gender, I think there's this sort of just notion, I guess, generally in society that women require protection. and that they are seen as extremely vulnerable. And then when you place them in a position where, especially they're experiencing domestic abuse, there is that sort of level of need of protection and kind of like support as victims of that sort of crime or different forms of abuse, and therefore they access specialist services like ourselves, like Advance, and other sort of external services, and us working to collaboratively can then support those women and their families to be able to try to move away from a life of fear, and provide that sort of independency. However, there is that level of need or care, and I think gender plays such a role in that. Whereas when you look at it on the opposite side, when I'm thinking about, and this is not my complete area, Caroline and Lisa are probably more likely able to speak to this, but when you think about them as women offenders, then suddenly it completely switches, so that the frame of mind is more that, well, this is kind of not conforming to gender forms, for example. It's very much like, well, a woman is now committing a crime, and that impact looks very different. The roles have switched, so therefore when you're in positions like within the criminal justice system, we support services here. We have specialist support services where women who are going through the criminal justice system who have experienced domestic abuse crimes, we have been commissioned to deliver specialist domestic abuse support. So we have caseworkers who are dedicated within a court setting when there is a case that's been charged, it's been prosecuted and goes through court, and then you have a domestic abuse coordinator who's dedicated to that space. And what we learn from those spaces is that when you are able to kind of deviate away from the sort of that sort of one-minded, that one-track way of looking at that criminal justice system, and you're able to kind of open it up to let like domestic abuse knowledge and history about that victim's situation come into play, then you're able to get a better understanding and history of what that person experienced, and it helps to contribute to the sentencing of that perpetrator as well. So you're now starting to see that you're seeing the criminal justice system being a bit more considerate around kind of like being a bit more lenient, I guess, to understanding how domestic abuse can impact that and has more vulnerabilities when you compare it to something where women is going through that process as someone who has committed that crime or seen to be committing that crime. There might be more harsher sentences, as some of my colleagues mentioned here. So there's a vast difference in how we might see gender play a part in this. Sorry, I have focused on gender, but it's such an important topic because it is a global issue for women, and it's not to say other genders don't experience it, but it is a gender-based crime, and the support that Advance provide, and the specialist support we provide to women is because of the research and the evidence that we see. And there is that disparity between how women are experiencing the criminal justice system when they are victims of crimes of domestic abuse in comparison to those who are going through the criminal justice system as those who have carried out offending behaviour, and seeing those disparities in the gender, because it does play a part in how we as a society look at gender as well.
Yeah,
there's probably so much more I can say there, but I've just focused on gender, and I'll let others come in.
I'm sure there is, and 45 minutes isn't long enough to talk about a subject like this. It isn't. But I wonder, could anyone come in and kind of talk about that, the kind of how race and economics play a part in that as well?
Absolutely. I think it's safe to say that we know that poverty is criminalized, and that's true for men and women. And absolutely, we see that even more starkly with women because of those biases in the way that the response to women being arrested looks. The fact that many men are not in prison for the same offences that women are in prison for, and the sort of scale of the acquisitive crimes that men are in prison for are typically on a much higher scale, as opposed to very low value offending, shoplifting, etc., that women can be criminalized for. And certainly in terms of race, we know that there's a host of intersection, whether it's thinking about harmful practices and honor-based abuse that women are experiencing, and then all the way through to the experience that women have in what is typically found to be a racist institution, along, you know, in terms of the findings of reviews looking into the police, etc., and how women are treated when they are from a global majority background, throughout from the courts, sentencing, their experiences in prison, probation, and the sort of stigma and biases that they might face along the way. So essentially, again, being doubly stigmatized and disadvantaged, whether it is from their socioeconomic status, their race, their cultural background, as well as their gender, as well as their sort of, like Ramisha said, that kind of the stigma of what women, of how women should behave, and then any deviation from that is seen as a abnormal sort of behavior and kind of an incorrect way of being a woman or being a mother or whatnot. So I think women have so many intersectional barriers that they face all the way through, and that goes through from sort of the police response to them as victim survivors, all the way through to the police response to them when they are themselves facing arrest. But certainly that's one of the reasons why Advance have a sort of ecosystem of partnerships. We have over 30 partners that we directly cascade funding to, because we think that it is so important to work with a woman as her whole self, and therefore bringing expertise and specialists to her so that she has a easily accessed network of onward signposting and referrals. So there's not a matter of saying, well, if you go speak to this organization over there, you'll get support. Actually, it's about us having a warm, welcoming sort of handover to that organization, that the woman doesn't have to tell her story over and over again and be re-traumatized by that. But actually, somebody's having a grand old time in the street below. But sort of that they are able to not feel that they have we are opening the door for them to access other services to deal with whatever specialisms and their needs might be. So whether that is demographic specialists, so such as LGBTQ plus specialists, or employability, pregnancy. Many of our partners are on the call here today. So it's wonderful to be able to have that ecosystem for women to access across the plethora of their needs on both the domestic abuse and VOG side, as well as their criminal justice needs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I will share kind of a handout after this event to kind of talk about some of these subjects, because we are running out of time. These things go very quickly, but I'll try and wrap a couple of questions in together. So we had a question on the chat, which feeds into one of my questions. So one, they've asked, do you find that the police are receptive to the work that we do? And I know that we can answer that on both sides, domestic abuse and criminal justice. And then if we could also look at what role the criminal justice system can play in ensuring that women get the support that they need earlier. And so that's kind of talking about the police, but courts, like you said, Caroline, and so on. So I will let you decide who wants to answer that. Lisa,
I'm happy to sort of, we've done a lot of work with the police over the years since we were founded in 1998. And I think, as with all things, the individual response is typically really positive, and we've had lots of extremely great, big advances with the police and a lot of energy and enthusiasm for change. I do think on an institutional level, however, it is difficult to make wide-scale changes, and that does take time, and we recognize that. So I think we're very optimistic about what the future holds, and sort of the momentum that we see in some aspects with the police response. I do think that the problems are extremely significant on either side, and will take a huge push and a concerted energy and effort from the government to make that change, and to make the change a permanent one. And so we see that there are, we can tend to see, as with all things, sometimes you get sort of positive steps forward, and then a change of government or a change in leadership, and things kind of go a little bit backwards. But certainly we know that there was a huge appetite when we formed our diversion project with the Mayor's Office and the Metropolitan Police in London to look at how we can better support women at the point of arrest. And that's a project that we've been running for several years now, and something that we've seen some momentum across police, with police commissioners' offices across the country. So certainly we're optimistic, I think, about the future, but recognize that this is a mammoth load of challenges that the police leadership need to change.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a big big job, but yes, we'll keep pushing. Is there any final thoughts from yourselves, Caroline, Lisa, Ramisha, just around any of the subject matters that we've kind of spoken about?
I guess I just, oh, sorry, carry on. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was just going to say, from a criminal justice perspective, I think the development of better partnership working both with the police and within the probation service and third sector partners is having a massive impact. And I think that sharing of knowledge and the understanding of issues that are unique to women is really making a difference. And I think, you know, the police sometimes operate in a difficult environment because they're dealing, you know, you're dealing with shifts, aren't you, that individuals are going out to different types of jobs. And sometimes it's needing somebody in a back office to look at a wider picture or a wider something that is going on. And I think, you know, the development of domestic abuse units within the police over several years have really impacted positively on that. There's always more work to be done, and there's almost different threads of funding that are needed for different things. You know, I would love to see something for the most difficult to engage women, you know, who often don't engage with services because they're the revolving doors, as we all talk about, and whether we could look at, you know, like an outreach service that we weren't looking so much always around key performance indicators, but distance traveled, trying to go out and engage those very complex women that, you know, are often the ones that have got substance misuse, significant mental ill health, their homelessness, and, you know, they're often being abused and exploited, whether through sex work, through committing offences on behalf of another, or as a form of protection for themselves from other you know, from other, and often they're associating with pro-criminal associates as opposed to the pro-social ones. And I would really love to see some work in terms of that, the outreach of the more complex women. But I do think we are taking a more positive step forward, and campaigning and us working together really does make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. We have run over a little bit, so if you can give 10 seconds, Ramisha, if you want to jump in and do a kind of 10 seconds last thought.
I think I echo what Summer and Caroline have said, and just to kind of mention that, yeah, the strong partnerships that we build to like collaboratively work together with police, health, social care, providing that education, because we're not the only specialists here. So working together in partnership has really led to bridging that gap, and that's what Advance, you know, can really showcase in that it works when we're working together collaboratively, and we share that education and that learning around from a domestic abuse perspective. We can identify those victim presentations, the perpetrator presentations, and that helps to get to the root cause of why that victim survivor is in the position that they are, and that can lead to a lot of system change. And that's some of the work that we've seen as we co-locate in health and social care and housing and police settings as well.
Absolutely. I hear that. Lisa, any parting words?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about taking part in some of the domestic homicide review work, when we look at findings and recommendations and what could have been done when you know it does get to the worst case scenario and somebody does lose their life, and how we can use that work to try and promote the changes and get working together. Again, it highlights from a lot of that work that really does work when people share concerns, when people work together, that we can try and capture these situations before we get to the worst case scenarios. So all of that work that goes on in the background is really, really important.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that just kind of coordinated community response is just so important, and that partnership working that that we try and promote. Well, we are over time. I'm really sorry that we ran over, but it is just such a massive subject, and we could probably go on for another 20-30 minutes. This is the third in our webinar series. We have one more next week, which is called A Call for Help. So please do consider registering. Otherwise, thank you very much. And yeah, we'll speak later.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Leonie.